Let me start with something honest. I've had so many moments in my life when I wanted to speak, but I didn't. Not because I didn't know the words, but because I was afraid of what might happen if I said them. I'd sit in a room, a classroom, a coffee shop, and the sentence would be there, in my head, fully formed. But it stayed trapped behind my lips because something inside me whispered, "What if I say it wrong? What if they don't understand me? What if they laugh?" So I stayed quiet. I smiled, I nodded, and I said nothing, even when I had something real to say. That's not just an English problem, that's a confidence problem, and it doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. Because fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up as silence. But here's what I've learned, and what I want to share with you. You don't need to know every word to speak. You don't need to sound like a native speaker to be understood. You don't need to wait until you're perfect. What you need is a reason to speak. A story. A moment that matters enough to break the silence. Because confidence doesn't grow from grammar books. It grows from real experiences, from little moments where you're scared but you speak anyway. And in this episode, I'm going to tell you one of those moments. A story about how I found my voice again. Not through a lesson, but through a simple conversation in a cafe on a rainy day. When I said one small sentence out loud and something in me shifted. This isn't a textbook. This is real life. And if you've ever been afraid to speak, I want you to know, you're not alone. I've been there too. And this story is for you. I walked into the cafe like a quiet question. It was a rainy Thursday. One of those days when the sky felt heavy and my thoughts had been waiting for sunlight. I sat by the window, ordered a cup of tea, and pulled out my notebook, not to study but to hide behind. Inside that notebook were English words, phrases I'd copied from songs, lines I'd heard in movies, quotes I didn't fully understand. But somehow they moved something inside me. I wasn't fluent. I wasn't confident. I had learned English the way many of us do, by memorizing rules, by fearing mistakes, by staying quiet even when I knew the answer. And now here I was, in London, surrounded by real conversations I couldn't join. People were laughing beside me. The barista was joking with a customer. Someone behind me was ordering a chai latte, and I stayed silent until the waiter came over with a gentle smile. "All good, love." 3 words. That's all it took to freeze me. It felt like a door had opened, not a big door, a soft one I could walk through if I was brave enough, and I wasn't sure. My fear said, "Don't say anything. You'll mess it up. You'll sound silly." But then, I remembered something I'd written in my notebook the night before. It's better to speak imperfect English than to stay perfectly silent. So I breathed and I said, "Yes, I am good, thank you." 5 words. Simple, but real. The waiter nodded. "Great. Let me know if you need anything, yeah?" And he walked away. But something stayed with me. Not his words. Not the smile. The feeling. The feeling that I had spoken. Out loud. In English. In the real world. I opened my notebook again. And wrote, "I spoke today. I made a sentence. I was scared. And I did it anyway." And that's the moment I started to believe something. Confidence doesn't start in your mouth. It starts in your heart. After that day in the cafe, something started to change. Not everything. Not suddenly. But enough. Enough that I stopped hiding behind the notebook. Enough that I started listening more, not to grammar, but to people. And a few days later, I found myself in the same cafe, same table, same seat by the window. Only this time, I wasn't writing. I was just sitting, quietly, when someone asked me a question, a man about my age. He sat at the table next to mine, looked over and said, "Hey, do you know what time they close?" I looked up. I could have pointed to the door and stayed silent. But instead, I answered, "I think maybe 6 o'clock? Ah, cool. Thanks, mate." Just 2 lines. Him asking, me answering. But for me, it was more than small talk. It was proof. Proof that I could respond. That I could join the rhythm. That I was no longer outside the conversation, I was in it. And the crazy thing is, I didn't speak perfectly. I forgot the word probably. I didn't use a full sentence. But you know what? He didn't care. He got the message. He smiled. And the world kept turning. I left the cafe that day feeling different. I walked slower, straighter, lighter. And when I got home, I wrote something new in my notebook. Not a quote, not a rule, just this. I used English today, in real life, with a real person, and I didn't panic. That sentence, that became my story. It wasn't about fluency. It was about bravery, because real confidence doesn't come from saying everything right. It comes from saying something honestly, even if it's small, even if it's messy, even if your voice shakes a little. After that second cafe moment, after the small question, the short answer, the feeling of I did it, I began a new habit. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't planned, but it changed everything for me. I started telling stories, not to an audience, not to impress anyone, not even out loud at first. I just started practicing small, real stories. In English, 5 minutes a day. Simple ones. What did I see today? What happened at the market? What did I hear on the train? I'd sit with my notebook and write something like, "Today I went to the bakery. The woman said, 'Morning, love.' I didn't know how to answer at first, but I smiled and said, 'Hi, can I get 1 loaf, please?' She asked, 'White or brown?' And I said, 'Brown, thank you.' She gave me the bread, smiled, and said, 'Have a nice day.' I walked out feeling proud. That was it. 1 loaf of bread, 1 real story. 1 moment of English that wasn't about grammar, it was about life. And the more I wrote these stories, the more I started saying them out loud. Not to a teacher. Not to a stranger, just to myself. In my room, in the mirror, or while walking. I'd whisper, "Today I went to the bakery." I spoke. I was nervous, but I spoke. And that simple habit turned into a daily practice. I didn't wait until I had perfect vocabulary. I used what I had. And I built my voice from there, because here's what I learned. Fluency grows from real memories, not fake dialogues and stories, even short, everyday stories. They teach your brain something powerful. I can speak. I do speak. I'm already doing it. In the beginning, I still translated everything. I'd think in my native language first, then try to turn the words into English in my head, and by the time I had the sentence ready, the moment was already gone. I'd smile. Stay quiet. Pretend I didn't want to say anything. But once I started practicing with my own little stories, the translation started to fade, slowly, softly, naturally. Why? Because I wasn't memorizing perfect sentences anymore. I was telling my truth. Today, I forgot my umbrella. I met someone kind on the train. I didn't understand the joke, but I still laughed. These were my stories, not textbook ones, not scripted. And something amazing started to happen. When I needed to speak in real life, my brain didn't go looking for grammar rules. It went looking for something familiar. It pulled from my stories. Oh, I've talked about this before. I've said these words to myself already. This isn't new. I've practiced it in my world. And that gave me a kind of quiet confidence. Not loud, not showy, just steady. Because I wasn't building fluency from fear. I was building fluency from memory, from personal memory. And that's the kind that stays. If you've ever felt stuck, trying to speak, it might not be because you don't know the words. It might be because you're waiting for permission to say something real. So here's what helped me. I stopped waiting. I started telling small stories, telling them in my voice. Even when I was the only one listening. There's something powerful about looking yourself in the eyes and saying a sentence out loud. That's what I started doing. Every morning, before I left the house, I'd stand in front of the mirror and say a story. Not a long one, not a complicated one, just something true. Sometimes it sounded like this. Yesterday I went to the library. I asked where the English books were. The woman said, "Second floor." I smiled. I thanked her. I found a book about London. I read the first chapter and understood most of it. I felt proud, and I'd watch myself speak it. Yes. I felt awkward at first. My mouth didn't move the way I wanted. My eyes looked unsure. My voice wasn't smooth, but I did it anyway. Because, here's the truth. The mirror doesn't judge you. It just reflects you. And sometimes, what we really need is to see ourselves speaking so we can believe it's possible. The more I did this, the more I noticed something. I wasn't just practicing words. I was practicing courage, and I was teaching my voice to sound like me. Not like a perfect textbook. Not like an actor, but like a real person. Someone who lives in the language, not just studies it. I'd even start changing my tone. I'd smile while telling a funny part. I'd slow down for emotional parts. I'd pause to breathe between thoughts. Without realizing it, I was learning spoken rhythm. The kind of English that's not written, but felt. If you've never tried this, please do. Take one small story. Look in the mirror and speak it to yourself, not to be perfect, but to prove to yourself that your voice has value. Because once you hear yourself speak with heart, you won't forget how it sounds. Something changed after a few weeks of mirror practice. I didn't notice it all at once. It happened quietly. But one morning, I was at a bakery. The woman at the counter smiled and said, "What can I get for you, love?" And without hesitation, I said, "1 brown loaf, please, and maybe a cinnamon roll?" She smiled. "Great choice. Anything else?" I paused. "No, thank you. That's all." It wasn't a long conversation, but it felt easy. Why? Because I had already told that story. To myself. In the mirror. Many times. I had practiced what I might say at the bakery. I had heard my own voice say it. So when the real moment came, it didn't feel like something new. It felt like something familiar, and that's what storytelling does for your English. It makes the world feel softer. It makes conversation feel like memory, not panic. Because when you've told a story before, your brain doesn't freeze. It says, "We've done this. We know how to say this." And even if your voice shakes a little, you still speak. Because it doesn't feel like your first time anymore. From that moment on, I started preparing stories in advance. Before I went to a doctor's appointment, I practiced how I might explain my symptoms. Before a train trip, I told myself a story about asking for directions, and slowly, those situations stopped scaring me because I wasn't walking in empty. I was walking in ready. I wasn't fluent. I still made mistakes. But I wasn't afraid anymore And that's the shift that matters. Let me tell you something honest. Even after all that practice, I still made mistakes. And sometimes, they were funny. Like the time I was at a restaurant and said, "I'd like the chicken, with no clothes, please." I meant to say, "no bones." But somehow, the word disappeared. The waiter raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "You mean, no, bones?" I laughed, a little embarrassed, but I nodded. "Yes, no bones, not naked. Sorry." He laughed too. "Don't worry. That's the best order I've had all day." We both smiled. And that was it. No one got angry. No one made me feel small. No one told me to stop speaking. That moment taught me something huge. Mistakes are just proof that you're using the language. And when you've been telling stories, when you've been practicing real phrases with emotion, you're not afraid to mess up, because your heart is stronger than your fear. Here's what I started doing every time I made a mistake. I told the story. I didn't hide from it. I didn't erase it. I shared it. With myself. With friends. Sometimes even online. Today, I said something silly in English, but I kept going, and it turned into a smile. That's how you become a real speaker. Not by being flawless, but by being honest. And when you do that, you start to enjoy the journey again. You stop waiting for perfection. You start looking for moments. Moments to try. Moments to laugh. Moments to connect. I've made so many wrong sentences, but every single one taught me something right. And one of the most powerful lessons was this: your mistakes don't make you less. They make you brave. The more I told my stories, the real ones, the awkward ones, the small but honest ones, the more I noticed something surprising. People started telling me their stories too. At first, it was just other learners like me, people who were afraid to speak, people who had stayed quiet in classrooms, people who were tired of feeling stupid, just because they didn't sound perfect. And when they heard me talk about saying chicken with no clothes, they laughed, not to mock me, but because they knew that feeling, that deep, shaky, embarrassing moment when your brain says one thing and your mouth says something completely different. But because I shared it with softness, with no shame, they felt safe to say. That happened to me too. I once said I'm boring instead of I'm bored. I called my teacher mother by mistake, and just like that, we weren't afraid anymore, because we realized something important. Fear disappears when we stop hiding, and stories help us stop hiding. They remind us, you're not the only one. This isn't failure, it's practice. Your voice still belongs. Sometimes I think the real power of storytelling isn't just about building your confidence. It's about giving someone else a reason to try. Because when you say, "I was scared, I tried anyway, and it was okay," someone else hears that and thinks, "Maybe I can try too." And that ripple effect, that quiet encouragement, is how we build a better world for English learners. Not with pressure, not with tests, but with patience. And stories that say, "You're enough, even now." For a long time, I thought, the goal was perfection, to speak without mistakes, to sound like a native speaker, to never pause, to never forget a word. But perfection was heavy. It made me nervous. It made me overthink. It made me feel like I was always behind. And the more I chased it, the more afraid I became, until storytelling taught me something different. It taught me to focus on progress, not perfection. Because stories aren't perfect. They're true, and truth doesn't need to be polished. It just needs to be real. When I told my stories, I didn't care if every verb was right. I cared if the message was clear, if the feeling was honest. I started asking myself, did I say something real today? Did I try? even when I felt scared? Did I speak with heart? If the answer was yes, then I had made progress. That shift from perfection to progress was everything. I no longer counted how many words I knew. I counted how many conversations I had the courage to join. I didn't measure how fast I could speak. I measured how brave I was when I wanted to stay silent but chose to speak anyway, and little by little, my English became lighter. Not because I knew more, but because I was no longer carrying the pressure to be flawless. I gave myself permission to be human, and the beautiful thing is, once I did that, I actually improved faster, because when your heart is free, your voice follows. There's something interesting that happened when I started telling stories in English. I thought it would only help me speak, but something else changed too. I started listening differently. Before, when someone spoke English to me, especially fast English, I'd panic. My brain would scramble, trying to catch every word, trying to translate in real time. And usually, I'd miss the meaning. But after I started telling stories out loud every day, something shifted. I knew the rhythm of the language better. I started recognizing patterns. I could guess what people meant even if I didn't catch every word, because I had already practiced that feeling in my stories. The flow, the tone, the pauses, the way emotion sounds in English. It wasn't just about words anymore. It was about energy, about attention, about connection. One day someone told me, "You're a really good listener." And I smiled, because I used to be the opposite. But storytelling taught me to slow down, to really hear how English lives, not just in grammar, but in people. And here's the big secret. Good speakers are always good listeners first. They hear with their heart, not just their ears. They don't interrupt. They don't chase the next sentence. They just feel what's being said. That's what storytelling trains you to do. Because when you practice sharing real things, you naturally learn to hold space for someone else's voice too. So if you want to speak with more confidence, don't just practice your voice. Practice your listening. The more deeply you listen, the more clearly you'll speak. And when that balance is there, something beautiful happens. You stop performing and start connecting. People often ask me, "How do you remember so many English words? Did you live abroad for years? Did you study every day?" And the truth is, I didn't memorize thousands of vocabulary lists. I didn't live in an English-speaking country for a long time, and I didn't study in the traditional way. What I did was tell stories. Every day, small ones, real ones, honest ones. And because those stories were about my life, my feelings, my moments, the words stayed with me. Because here's something you might not realize. We remember emotions more than information. When you connect a word to something you feel, you don't forget it. I didn't forget the word lost because I used it to describe the day I got on the wrong train. I didn't forget the word kind because I used it in the story about the woman who helped me find my stop. I didn't forget the word proud because I used it in the story about the first time I asked a full question in English without freezing. These weren't flashcards. They were my life, and my life, in English, became my memory bank. I realized that the more I told stories, the more naturally words would come. I wasn't forcing vocabulary into my brain. I was allowing it to live in my world. And because I told the same stories more than once, in slightly different ways, I started building natural flow. I didn't just learn words. I learned how to use them with rhythm, with timing, with emotion. That's what storytelling does. It takes dry language and turns it into something alive. something you don't just repeat but feel. So no, I didn't memorize a dictionary. Just told stories that were worth remembering, and those stories helped me become someone who doesn't just know English, but lives in it. Let's be real. There were days I wanted to give up. Days when English felt too hard, too fast, too much. Days when I felt like I was still at the beginning, even after months of effort. I'd watch someone speak so smoothly, without thinking, without pausing, and I'd wonder, will I ever get there? And then my brain would whisper things like, you're too slow. You're too old. You're not improving. Maybe English just isn't for you. But on those days, I went back to my stories, not the ones in books, the ones in my notebook, the time I asked for directions and understood the reply, the time I made a stranger laugh even by accident, the time I ordered food and the person said, "Your English is good." I'd reread those moments. I'd retell them out loud. And every time I did, I'd remember something important. I've come further than I think. Storytelling became my proof. Proof that I was trying. Proof that I was growing. Proof that even if today was hard, yesterday had a win. We all need reminders. And for me, stories were that reminder. I didn't need a grade. I didn't need a certificate. I just needed to hear myself say, I did this, I lived this, and I'm still going. That's the power of tracking your journey through stories. It's not about ego. It's about evidence. Evidence that you've shown up, even when it was tough, even when your progress felt invisible. And the more I reminded myself of what I'd done, the more motivated I felt to keep going. So if you're tired right now, if your English feels stuck, if you feel slow, behind, or discouraged, please go back to your story. Read it again. Say it again. Believe in it again. You're further than you think. Something unexpected happened after I spent enough time telling my own stories. I began helping others tell theirs. Not because I was a teacher, not because I was an expert, but because I understood what it felt like to be afraid, to feel stuck, to want to speak, and not know how. One day, a friend who was also learning English said to me, "You speak so clearly. How did you become so confident?" And I smiled, because the truth was, I didn't feel confident. I just had experience. Experience telling my truth day after day in simple, honest English. So I said, I practice by telling stories. I don't study for tests. I just speak about life, the small things. She looked at me for a moment, then said, "But my life is boring." And I told her something that changed both of us. There's no such thing as a boring story. If it's real, it's worth sharing. And if it's shared with heart, it becomes powerful. So we sat down together, and I helped her tell one. It was about her first time going to the supermarket alone, how she asked where the eggs were, how she misunderstood something, how she got nervous but didn't give up. It was short. It was simple, but it was real. And when she told it out loud, for the first time in her voice, I could see something shift. She didn't just speak. She believed herself. That's when I knew. The stories we live aren't just for us. They're for someone else too, someone who needs to hear. You're not the only one. It's okay to be nervous. Mistakes are allowed here. We're learning together. The more I helped others tell their stories, the more I understood my own voice. And with every story shared, my fear faded. Because when you speak to lift someone else, you stop worrying about how you sound. You focus on how they feel. There was a time when English felt like a mountain I was trying to climb. Every word was a rock, every sentence a struggle, and every mistake felt like falling. But something changed when I started telling stories. Suddenly, English didn't feel like a test anymore. It felt like a tool, a bridge, a quiet space where I could express something real. I didn't have to impress anyone. I didn't have to pass an exam. I just had to say what happened, how I felt, and why it mattered. And that's when I fell in love with English again. Not because it was easy, but because it became mine. I didn't feel like a visitor anymore. I felt like a resident, someone who belonged in the language, not because I spoke perfectly, but because I spoke honestly. English used to feel cold. Now it feels warm. It used to make me nervous. Now it gives me strength. It used to be something I feared. Now it's something I live in, and storytelling made that possible. Because stories aren't about rules. They're about rhythm. They're not about perfection. They're about presence. And when I stopped chasing perfect and started sharing what was true, my relationship with English became peaceful. I stopped asking, "Am I saying this right?" and started asking, "Am I saying something that matters?" And every time I did that, my voice grew, not louder, but deeper, wiser, calmer. Because I wasn't just learning a language anymore. I was growing in it. If you've listened this far, then maybe, deep inside, you're ready to speak. Not fluently, not perfectly, but honestly, and that's enough. You don't need a degree in English. You don't need to sound like anyone else. You don't even need to speak loudly. You just need to start with one story. Your story. So here's what I'd love for you to do. Today, take 5 minutes. Sit in a quiet place and ask yourself, what did I experience today? What made me smile or struggle? What sentence would I say if I weren't afraid? Then, say it. Whisper it. Write it. Tell it to the mirror. Say it out loud. While walking. Record it on your phone. Speak it softly into your own hands, because that small moment, that real, raw story, is where confidence begins. It's not a lesson. It's not a class. It's you, choosing to live in the language, instead of hiding from it. You don't need to wait for someone to give you permission. You are the permission. You are the reason. You are the story. And your voice is not too quiet to matter. So tell it. Tell your first story. Tell your next one. And keep going. This episode wasn't about grammar. It wasn't about structure. It wasn't even about vocabulary. It was about voice. Your voice. The one that's been waiting to come out. Not when you're fluent, but now. Because confidence doesn't come after fluency. It comes before. It's what gets you to fluency. Thank you for walking through this story with me today. If it gave you something, a little peace, a little courage, a little reminder that your voice matters, then share it with a friend, with a stranger, or simply with yourself again tomorrow. Because every time you tell your story, you become more fluent in the most important language of all. Belonging. From here on, you're not just an English learner. You are a storyteller, and storytellers speak with soul, not fear. I'll be here for your next story. Until then, keep learning, keep speaking, and most of all, keep believing that your voice is enough. I used to begin every sentence with an apology. Sorry for my English. Sorry, I don't speak well. Sorry if this sounds wrong. It became a habit. I didn't even think about it. The words just came out, automatic, nervous, small, even when people were kind. Even when no one asked me to apologize. Even when my English was completely understandable, I still said sorry. Why? Because deep down, I didn't believe my English was good enough. I didn't believe I was good enough. So I thought if I apologized first, maybe people would be more patient. Maybe they'd forgive me for not sounding perfect. Maybe I'd protect myself from embarrassment by admitting my weakness before they noticed it. But here's the truth I learned later. Saying sorry for your English doesn't make people respect you more. It makes you respect yourself less. I didn't know that back then. I thought I was being polite. But really, I was shrinking myself, making myself smaller than I needed to be. And over time, that habit, that apology, started to hurt my confidence. Because every time I said, sorry for my English, I was reminding myself, you're not good enough yet. You're a problem. You're not allowed to speak freely. And the more I repeated that, the more I believed it. That's where this story begins, in a place of fear, of habit, of unnecessary apologies. But what changed? That's what I'm about to share. Because the day I stopped apologizing for my English, everything changed. I remember the exact moment something shifted. I was in a small group conversation at a language exchange event, just 5 or 6 of us. Different accents, different comfort levels, but all of us there to speak without pressure. I was sharing something about my hometown, and as usual, I started with, sorry for my English, it's not very good, but then I continued, awkwardly. A few people smiled, nodded, listened politely. But after the event, one of the girls from the group walked over to me. She said, "Hey, can I tell you something? You really don't need to apologize for your English." I froze a little. You were easy to understand. Your story was great. You sound better than you think. So when you say sorry first, it makes me sad. Because it's not true. She didn't say it in a mean way. She said it kindly, like someone who wanted me to stop. Putting myself down, and I didn't know what to say. I just stood there feeling exposed, but also seen, because deep inside, I knew she was right. That night, I went home and sat with those words. It makes me sad, because it's not true. And I asked myself, why am I still apologizing when the people around me are already listening? Why am I trying to protect myself from something that isn't even happening? Why am I giving fear a microphone before I give myself a voice? That night was the first time I wrote a new sentence in my notebook. Today, I didn't need to say sorry. And next time, I won't. It was a small decision, but it changed everything because I stopped starting with weakness and started speaking with honesty, not arrogance, not ego, just truth. She didn't say it in a mean way. She said it kindly, like someone who wanted me to stop putting myself down, and I didn't know what to say. I just stood there feeling exposed, but also seen, because deep inside, I knew she was right. It started with good intentions. I wanted to speak more English, to push myself, to stop hiding in silence and just try. So I told myself, today I'll speak to a real person, no matter what, no excuses. I chose the bakery near my flat. The people there were friendly. I had been there before, but always. Pointed at the bread, nodded, smiled, and said nothing else. But this time would be different. I was going to speak. I had practiced the sentence all morning. Hi, can I get a loaf of brown bread, please? Simple. Clear. I was ready, or so I thought. I walked in. The shop was quiet. The woman behind the counter smiled. Hi there, what can I get you? I opened my mouth, and my brain went blank. The sentence disappeared. My mouth froze. The pressure exploded in my chest. I tried to recover but everything came out wrong. Yes, I want one black bread? Sorry, the not white one, please. She looked confused. You mean brown bread? Yes, brown. Sorry, learning. My English not good, she smiled gently. Handed me the loaf. I paid, left quickly, and the second I stepped outside, my eyes filled with tears. Not because she was rude. She wasn't. Not because I couldn't communicate. I did, kind of. But because I felt like I failed. Again. All that preparation. All that practice. And still, I sounded like a beginner. That was the day I almost gave up. But it was also the day everything started to change. Because failure didn't break me. It revealed me. And what came next? That's the part I never expected. That night, I went home and sat with those words. It makes me sad. Because it's not true. And I asked myself, why am I still apologizing when the people around me are already listening? Why am I trying to protect myself from something that isn't even happening? Why am I giving fear a microphone before I give myself a voice? That night was the first time I wrote a new sentence in my notebook. Today, I didn't need to say sorry. And next time, I won't. It was a small decision, but it changed everything because I stopped starting with weakness and started speaking with honesty, not arrogance, not ego, just truth. The next day, I was nervous. Again, I had to speak English at a local event, just a small gathering, nothing serious. But I knew I'd need to introduce myself. I practiced what I might say. Hi, I'm from... I work in... I love learning languages. And my brain kept wanting to add, sorry for my English. But I caught it. I paused, took a breath, and asked myself, do I need to apologize? Or am I just used to doing it? So when it was my turn to speak, I looked around the room, smiled, and said, hi, my name is Kake. I've been learning English for a while now. I'm here to meet people and practice. No apology, no shame, just me. And you know what happened? Nothing bad. No one laughed. No one looked confused. No one corrected me. In fact, someone said, your English is really good. And I almost cried, not because I needed the compliment, but because I realized I'd been holding myself back for no reason. I'd been opening every door with an apology when I didn't need to ask permission to be here in the first place. That moment stayed with me, because when you speak without saying sorry, you don't just sound stronger. You feel stronger. From that day on, I started paying attention. Every time I wanted to apologize, I paused, breathed, and replaced it with a simple truth. This is my voice, and it's allowed. After that day, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't erase my voice with the word sorry anymore, but I still wanted to be polite. I still wanted to show respect. I just didn't want to shrink myself before I even had the chance to speak. So I started replacing sorry with something more real, something honest, something confident, something human. Let me show you what I mean. Before, sorry for my English. Now, I'm still learning, but I'd love to try. Before, sorry if I sound strange. Now, let me know if anything I say isn't clear. Before, sorry, I don't speak well. Now, I'm working on my speaking. Thanks for your patience. Before, sorry, I'm not very fluent. Now, I'm growing every time I speak. Do you feel the difference? It's still kind, still soft, still respectful. But now, it comes from strength, not from shame, because there's nothing wrong with being a learner. But there is something wrong with telling yourself you're less, just because you haven't arrived yet. And once I changed the way I spoke about myself, my confidence began to grow. Not because I became fluent overnight, but because I stopped attacking myself before giving myself a chance. So the next time you're about to say, "Sorry for my English," pause and ask yourself, am I really sorry? Or am I just scared to be seen? Then take a breath and speak your truth instead, because your voice deserves to arrive with presence, not apology. Once I stopped starting every sentence with an apology, I noticed something I didn't expect. People started responding to me differently. Not because my grammar got perfect overnight, not because I suddenly sounded fluent, but because my energy changed. When I spoke with fear, people treated me like someone who needed help. They were polite, but distant. But when I spoke with confidence, even gentle confidence, they leaned in. They listened more closely. They smiled more often. They treated me like someone worth hearing. And I realized something powerful. The way you speak about yourself teaches people how to treat you. When I used to say, "Sorry, I know my English is bad," people believed me, even if it wasn't true. But when I started saying, "I'm still learning, but I enjoy speaking," people gave me space. They gave me time. They gave me respect. Not because I sounded perfect, but because I believed in my voice, and that belief made them believe too. Here's the quiet truth I want to share. Native speakers don't need you to sound perfect. They just need you to sound present, and presence comes from self-respect. The moment I stopped apologizing, I gave others permission to connect with me as an equal, not as someone they had to fix or correct, and the conversations that followed felt warmer, smoother, more human. If you want people to see you differently, start by speaking to yourself differently. And when your voice comes from self-trust, the world listens differently too. There was a moment, and I remember it clearly, when I realized something I never expected. I didn't need to prove my English anymore, not to teachers, not to strangers, not even to myself. I was in a coffee shop, ordering a drink. It was a busy morning. The barista looked rushed. She asked me a quick question. "Is that for here or to go?" I didn't panic. I didn't translate. I didn't apologize. Just smiled and said, "To go, please." "That's it," she nodded, wrote it down, moved on, and I stood there, calm, present, free. Because in that moment, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just living, using my voice to do something simple, something natural, something enough. That's when I realized I don't owe anyone a perfect accent. I don't owe anyone flawless grammar. I don't even owe them an explanation. I owe myself permission to exist in English. Without apology, without shame, without pressure to perform. I stopped trying to impress. I started trying to connect, and that shift gave me a kind of peace I'd never felt before. If you're always trying to prove your English, you'll always feel like you're behind, but when you stop apologizing and just start participating, you become part of the conversation. Not as a student, as a speaker, as a human being. And that's more powerful than any grammar rule you'll ever learn. If there's one thing I wish someone had told me earlier, it's this. You don't have to apologize for not being perfect in English. You don't have to say sorry before you say something beautiful, something honest, something real. You don't need to shrink your voice just to make others comfortable, because your English on exactly as it is right now has value, even if it's slow, even if it's broken, even if it still feels uncertain. It's yours. And that makes it enough. So if you're still saying, "Sorry for my English," please stop. Not because you're wrong, but because you're more ready than you think. Say instead, "Thanks for listening. I'm still learning, but I'm proud of what I've learned. This is how I grow, by speaking anyway. And watch what happens. The world will shift around you. People will respond differently. But more importantly, you will feel different. Not because your words got better, but because your heart got lighter." It started with good intentions. I wanted to speak more English, to push myself, to stop hiding in silence and just try. So I told myself, today I'll speak to a real person, no matter what. No excuses. I chose the bakery near my flat. The people there were friendly. I had been there before, but always. Pointed at the bread, nodded, smiled, and said nothing else. But this time would be different. I was going to speak. I had practiced the sentence all morning. "Hi, can I get a loaf of brown bread, please?" Simple, clear. I was ready. Or so, I thought. I walked in. The shop was quiet. The woman behind the counter smiled. "Hi there, what can I get you?" I opened my mouth, and my brain went blank. The sentence disappeared. My mouth froze. The pressure exploded in my chest. I tried to recover, but everything came out wrong. "Yes, I want one black bread? Sorry. The not white one. Please." She looked confused. "You mean brown bread?" "Yes. Brown. Sorry, learning. My English not good." She smiled gently, handed me the loaf. I paid, left quickly. And the second I stepped outside, my eyes filled with tears. Not because she was rude. She wasn't. Not because I couldn't communicate. I did. Kind of. But because I felt like I failed. Again. All that preparation, all that practice, and still, I sounded like a beginner. That was the day I almost gave up. But it was also the day everything started to change. Because failure didn't break me. It revealed me. And what came next? That's the part I never expected. When I got home, I dropped the bread on the counter and sat down with my head in my hands. I felt like a child, embarrassed, frustrated, tired. I had tried so hard to speak clearly, but what came out felt clumsy, broken, unnatural, and the worst part? That voice in my head came back. "You're not good enough. You'll never sound fluent. Why even try?" But this time, I didn't let it speak for long, because something inside me said, "No, you spoke, you showed up, and that counts for more than you think." So I opened my notebook, and I wrote everything down, not just the mistake, but the moment. I tried to say, "Can I get a loaf of brown bread?" But I said, "Black, the not white, sorry, learning." I froze. I panicked, but I finished. Then I wrote the most important line. I didn't give up. And that matters more than getting it right, because in that moment I realized something powerful. Fluency doesn't come from speaking perfectly. It comes from speaking, especially when it's messy. That day taught me more than any textbook ever could. It taught me that fear doesn't mean I'm failing. It means I'm growing, that every mistake is a message to my brain. This is how we learn now. not by silence, but by doing. And that simple shift, from shame to story, became the reason I started speaking more. The next day, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to go back to the bakery. Same time. Same shop, same counter. Why? Because I didn't want that moment, that failure, to become fear. I didn't want to avoid the place where I had struggled. I wanted to reclaim it. So I got dressed, took a breath, and walked out the door. On the way there, my heart was pounding. My brain whispered, "What if you mess up again? What if she remembers you?" But I answered myself, "So what? She was kind. I'm allowed to try again." I walked in. She looked up, smiled. "Morning, what can I get you?" And this time, I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I smiled back and said, "Hi, I'd like 1 loaf of brown bread, please." She didn't pause. "Coming right up," I paid, said thank you, and walked out. No apology, no mistake, no shame, just a normal interaction, in English. And that moment felt like flying, because now that place was no longer where I failed. It was where I got up. From that day on, I started doing something new. Every time I struggled in English in a public place, I went back, not to prove something, but to show myself. This is a learning space now, not a shame space. And every time I did that, I became stronger, not just as a speaker, but as a person. After that second bakery visit, something shifted inside me. I started seeing public mistakes differently. Before, they were something I feared. Now, they became part of my training. I realized something that no one told me in school. Private study builds knowledge, but public struggle builds fluency. Reading grammar rules at home helped, yes, but speaking out loud, when things were real, when people were waiting, when my voice was shaky, that's what actually made me grow. Because real-life speaking forces your brain to stop hiding. You don't get to rehearse. You don't get to perfect every sentence. You just speak. And every time I failed a little, I learned a lot. There were days I forgot a word, days I misunderstood a question, days I froze mid-sentence. But every one of those moments became a lesson, not because someone corrected me, but because I stayed in the conversation. I didn't run. I didn't quit. I didn't disappear. I just breathed and tried again. And here's the beautiful part. The more I did it, the less I froze. My sentences got shorter but more natural. My pauses became softer, not panicked. My rhythm started to match the people around me. I wasn't trying to sound perfect anymore. I was trying to stay connected, and that's when my English started flowing. Not like a textbook, but like me. For years, every time I made a mistake in English, I felt like I had failed. A wrong word, a missing article, a sentence that ended in confusion. Each one used to feel like a disaster. Until one day, after a long conversation where I stumbled at least 5 times, I walked away thinking, wow, I just had a real conversation. And I smiled. Not because I said everything right, but because I said everything anyway. That's when something inside me clicked. Mistakes are not the opposite of fluency. They're the path to it. Think about a baby learning to walk. Every step they take ends with a fall, but we don't say they failed. We say they're learning. We celebrate every wobble, every tumble, every tiny push forward. So why are we so hard on ourselves as adults? Why do we expect ourselves to speak like professionals while we're still learning how to stand? That day, I made a choice. I would stop calling my mistakes failures. I would start calling them evidence of progress, and that one change freed my voice. Now, when I forget a word, I pause. I breathe. I try another word. If I confuse the past tense, I smile and keep going. If someone corrects me, I say, "Thank you." And I try again. I no longer feel the need to be perfect. I feel the need to keep moving, and that mindset, that forward energy, has become my fluency engine. If you take one thing from this story, please let it be this. Your next mistake is not something to avoid. It might be the moment that helps you grow. I used to think that failing in public would make me feel small, and sometimes it did. But now I know something else is true. Every time I failed and kept going, I built something stronger than English. I built courage, and courage is what makes fluency possible. So if you're listening to this right now, and you've been holding back, if you've been waiting for the perfect sentence, the perfect timing, the perfect level of confidence, let this episode be your permission to speak imperfectly, to show up, to make a mess, to forget the word, smile, and keep speaking. Because you never know. That one awkward conversation, that one moment where you feel embarrassed, might become the exact story that makes you fluent. There was a time when I didn't speak English at all, even when I could. Not because I didn't know the words. I had studied. I had practiced. I had memorized so many phrases, but when the moment came, I stayed silent. I didn't say, "Hi." I didn't say, "Excuse me." I didn't even say my name when I introduced myself. I smiled. I nodded. I pointed, and the silence became a habit. I remember standing in line at a shop. The woman at the counter smiled and asked, "How are you today?" And I froze. I knew what she said. I knew how to answer. "I'm fine, thank you." But I couldn't say it. Not because I didn't understand, but because I didn't want to sound wrong, because deep down I believed that silence was safer than shame. So I just smiled. And she moved on. And I remember walking out of the shop feeling like I had missed something important. Not a grammar point. Not a test, a moment, a connection. That's where this story begins. Not with courage, but with hesitation. Not with confidence, but with silence. But as you'll hear, those quiet days didn't last forever, because small talk, the thing I was most afraid of, ended up becoming the very thing that made me feel alive in English. It didn't happen in a classroom. It didn't happen during a lesson. It happened at a cafe, a quiet one, the kind where people sit with books and soft music. I was there alone. Same table I always sat at, same notebook in front of me, same silence. And then a man sitting near me looked over and said, "Hey, do you know if they have Wi-Fi here?" It caught me off guard. My first instinct was to panic, to nod, to smile, to say nothing, but something inside me answered before fear could stop it. "Yes, I think so. The password is on the board." He smiled. "Ah, great. Thanks." Just that. One question, one answer, but it felt like a door opened in my chest. Because that was the first time someone spoke to me without knowing I was scared. And I answered. Without apologizing, without running, without overthinking. We didn't become friends, we didn't talk for hours. But in that one exchange, I realized something I hadn't felt before. I can do this, not speak perfectly, not hold a speech, but speak, naturally, briefly, honestly. That's all it takes to begin. After that cafe moment, I didn't suddenly become outgoing. I didn't start talking to everyone I met. But something inside me had changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, it was a quiet permission. You're allowed to speak, even if it's short, even if it's simple. So I started trying. Not every day, but slowly. The woman at the grocery store would say, "How's your day going?" And instead of staying silent, I'd say, "Good, thank you. And you?" Or at the park, someone would ask, "Do you know what time the cafe opens?" And I'd say, "I think it's open now." I saw someone go in. Tiny moments, short replies, but every one of them became a brick in the foundation of my fluency. I realized that small talk isn't about deep conversation. It's about showing up. It's about connection, even for 10 seconds. It's about saying, "I exist. I'm here. I want to connect." And every time I joined a moment of small talk, I felt a little stronger. Not because of the words, but because of the feeling. I can do this. That's something a textbook can't give you, but one real smile, one short exchange can. Once I realized that small talk didn't have to be big or scary, I started noticing patterns, little phrases that showed up again and again, the kind that people used to be polite, to be kind, to break the silence just for a moment. And the more I heard them, the more I started using them too. Here are some of the ones that changed everything for me. "How's your day going?" I heard it everywhere, in cafes, in shops, even in elevators. At first, I didn't know how to answer, but I practiced. Now I say, "Good, thanks. Just taking it slow today." Or, "Not bad, just running some errands." Wait. "Nice weather today, isn't it?" It sounds simple, even silly, but it opens the door. And now I reply, "Yeah, finally some sunshine." Or, "It's a bit cold for me, but better than rain." 3. Busy day? I used to freeze when someone said this. Now I say, "A little. But I like staying active." Or, "Yes, but I'm getting through it." These sentences, they're not complicated, but they're powerful because they let people know I'm not just learning English, I'm living in it. And every time I used one of those phrases, even if my voice was soft, even if I still felt nervous inside, people responded with a smile, with a nod, with a kind reply. That's when I started to feel like I belonged, not because I sounded fluent, but because I sounded present. Before I started speaking, even just a little, I felt invisible. Not because people were unkind, not because they ignored me, but because I wasn't showing up in the room. Not fully, not with my voice. I'd walk into a store, say nothing, buy what I needed, leave quietly. No eye contact, no connection, no conversation. And when you repeat that every day, you start to believe, maybe I don't belong in this language. Maybe I'm not ready. Maybe I'm meant to stay quiet. But then came the small talk, the tiny exchanges, the everyday moments where someone spoke to me, and I chose to respond, even with just 5 words. Even when I stumbled and something changed, I started feeling seen, not just as a customer, not just as a foreigner, as a person. Because when someone looks you in the eye, asks how your day is going, and listens to your answer, you feel like you matter. And when you answer back, you claim your space. Not in a loud way, not with perfect English, but with presence, with courage, with honesty. That's when I stopped feeling invisible. Not because people suddenly noticed me, but because I started showing up. If you've ever stayed silent because you were afraid, I understand. If you've ever avoided eye contact, or nodded instead of answering, or walked away feeling invisible, I've been there too. But let me tell you what changed my life. It wasn't a long speech. It wasn't a grammar book. It wasn't A perfect accent. It was one sentence, a small one, spoken with a shaky voice. But spoken anyway. Small talk is often laughed at, but it's not small at all. It's how strangers become friends. It's how you tell the world, I'm here. I may be learning, but I'm ready to live in this language. And every time you join a little conversation, even for 5 seconds, you grow. Because confidence doesn't come from long conversations. It comes from showing up in small moments, and if you show up enough, you stop feeling like a learner. You start feeling like a speaker. There are days when I wake up tired, not just physically, but emotionally. Days when I don't want to talk. Not in my first language, and especially not in English, because speaking in another language takes energy. Energy to focus. Energy to translate, energy to be brave, again. And when you're already tired, it feels like too much. Some days, I walk into a shop and I want to say hello, but my body says, just stay quiet. Get what you need, go home. And when someone smiles at me and asks, how are you today? I hear the words. I understand the meaning, but inside, my voice says, not today. I don't have it in me. I'm not rude. I'm not lazy. I'm just human. And sometimes my quiet side takes over. But even on those days, something inside me still wants to grow, still wants to speak, still wants to be part of the world, and that's what this episode is about. How I learned to speak English not only when I felt strong, but when I felt shy. Low, quiet. Because fluency, I doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes it sounds like a whisper. And that's still enough. When I first started learning English, I thought I had to be energetic all the time. Fast, clear, confident. But the truth is, that's not always possible. There were mornings when my brain felt cloudy, my energy felt low, my confidence was sleeping, and on those days I didn't feel like talking, but I still wanted to grow. So I created a small routine, something soft, something slow, something just for me. Every morning I'd whisper a few sentences to myself. Not a speech, not a long paragraph, just something small, something like, today is quiet, and that's okay. I may not speak much today, but I'll try. One sentence is better than none. That was my warm-up. No pressure, no judgment, just presence. Because I learned something important. Your voice doesn't need to be loud to be useful. It just needs to be real. Some days, I only said one thing, out loud. Maybe at the bakery, maybe at the bus stop, maybe in front of the mirror, but I said it. And that one small sentence, spoken with softness, spoken with effort, was still English, still practice, still progress. So if you're shy or if you're tired or if you're quiet by nature, you don't have to change who you are to speak English. You just have to meet yourself where you are and speak from that place, even if it's just a whisper. I realized early on, I didn't learn best in loud places. Busy cafes, crowded. Streets, group conversations with fast-moving words, they overwhelmed me. But give me a quiet corner of a bookstore, or a peaceful walk through a park, and I'd start to relax. And when I was relaxed, I could speak. Not much, not fast, but honestly. So that's what I started doing. I stopped forcing myself into environments that didn't match my personality. And I began to speak English in the kinds of spaces that made me feel calm. In bookshops, I'd ask, do you have something short and easy to read? In parks, I'd talk to myself quietly. It's sunny today. I like the trees. The air is soft. In cafes, I'd order with just a few words. Tea with milk, please. For here. And each of those small, simple moments became part of my voice. Because the truth is, you don't need a loud room to become fluent. You need a safe one, a place where your fear can soften, where your words can come out slowly, where your voice isn't competing with noise and it's unfolding gently. That's where my English began to feel natural, not in the noise, but in the peace. There's something I used to believe, that in order to connect with people in English, I had to be outgoing, talkative, energetic, but I was never that person, not in my first language, and definitely not in English. I used to worry, will people think I'm boring? Will they lose patience with me? What if my silence makes them uncomfortable? But then something surprising happened. I met people who didn't need me to speak fast, who didn't rush me, who didn't fill the silence with pressure. They asked simple things. You okay? Want to sit here? What do you think? And I replied in soft, slow English. Yes. Thank you. I like it here. I'm still learning, but I enjoy this. And they smiled. Not because I said something clever, but because I said something true. That's when I realized connection doesn't require volume. It requires presence. You don't have to talk a lot to be remembered. You don't have to tell long stories to be respected. You just have to be honest and willing to share a little. And sometimes a soft answer from the heart can go further than a loud one from the head. When I first started learning English, I didn't feel like myself. I felt like a version of me, a smaller, simpler, quieter version. I had thoughts, but I couldn't express them. I had feelings, but they didn't translate the way I wanted them to. I had a personality, but it didn't come through in the language yet, so when I spoke, I felt distant from who I was. In my first language, I was calm, but expressive, thoughtful, but warm, quiet, but funny sometimes. But in English, I felt flat, awkward, like someone watching from the outside. It was frustrating because I knew who I was, but I didn't know how to be that person in English, and that's where this story begins. I used to think fluency was just about grammar. But I've learned something else. Fluency is also about identity, and every phrase you learn is a step toward becoming more of yourself in a new language. In this episode, I'm going to share the moments where English didn't just help me speak, it helped me discover who I was becoming. One phrase at a time. It was a small phrase, just a few words. But when I heard it, I felt something shift inside me. I was at a small community gathering, just a circle of people chatting. Someone said something funny. Everyone laughed, and the man beside me looked at me and said, "You've got a good sense of humor." I paused, because in that moment I felt like me. He didn't say, "You speak good English." He didn't say, "Nice grammar." He saw something about me, not just my language level. "You've got a good sense of humor." That one sentence made me realize that I was starting to exist in English as more than just a learner. I was becoming a person, with a voice, with personality, with presence. I went home and wrote that phrase in my notebook, not to memorize it, but to remember how it made me feel. You've got a good sense of humor. That was the first time English gave me something back, not just vocabulary, but identity. It said, you're not just speaking, you're being seen. After that moment, after hearing someone say, "You've got a good sense of humor," I started paying more attention to how people spoke to me, to the small phrases they used, to how certain words didn't just communicate, they connected. There was one I'll never forget. I was speaking slowly, nervously, trying to explain something, and someone said to me, kindly, "Take your time, I'm listening." That sentence stopped me in my tracks, because in that moment, I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel rushed. I felt safe, seen. Another time, I made a small mistake, used the wrong verb. I corrected myself mid-sentence, feeling embarrassed, and the person smiled and said, "You're doing great. Don't worry, I understand you." Again, something inside me softened, because these phrases weren't about my English. They were about me. They were giving me space to exist in the language without shame. They told me, you don't have to be perfect to be understood. You don't have to speak fast to be respected. You don't have to apologize to be welcomed. And slowly, those little moments started rebuilding how I saw myself. Not as someone trying to fit in, but as someone who belonged. Even in my pauses, even in my quiet moments, even with mistakes. At first, I only noticed the words others used, the soft ones, the patient ones, the phrases that made me feel safe, seen, and human. But over time, I started using those phrases too. Not just copying them, not just practicing pronunciation, but really meaning them. One day, someone was struggling to speak to me. A newer learner, slower than me. They paused a lot, apologized, looked down, and I said, "Take your time. I'm listening." The exact words someone once said to me, and the look on their face, I recognized it. It was the same relief I felt when someone first gave me space to speak. That's when I realized the words we choose don't just express who we are, they shape who we become. When I said things like, "You're doing great," "No rush," "I get what you mean," "Don't worry, I make that mistake too," I started becoming the version of myself I had always wanted to be in English. Kind, calm, supportive, and confident. Not in how perfect I sounded, but in how I made other people feel. And that changed everything. Because when you start to express kindness, you don't just use the language. You live in it. You bring yourself to it. Sometimes we think English is just a skill, a tool, a requirement, a job qualification. But for me, it became something deeper. It became a mirror, a doorway, a quiet path I walked to discover myself in a different language in every phrase I spoke. It wasn't just about being understood, it was about becoming more of who I already was. But in new words, new rhythm, new light. So if you're learning English now and you feel like you don't fully sound like you yet, that's okay. You're not behind. You're in the process. And every time you say something that feels true, a phrase that's yours not just memorized but felt, you are building something inside you, a voice. An identity, a self that's not new but expanded. You're not losing who you are by learning English. You're discovering how big you can become. There was a time in my life when I believed my English wasn't worth sharing. I told myself, my grammar isn't ready. My accent isn't clear enough. My vocabulary is too limited. Someone else can say it better. So I stayed quiet, even when I had something to say. Even when I had a story to share. Even when I felt something true inside me that wanted to come out. I held it back. Because I thought my voice didn't deserve to be heard. Not yet. Not until it was better. Not until I was better. But over time, I learned something that changed everything. I learned that your English voice is not a performance. It's not something you earn. It's something you already own. You don't have to wait until you sound like someone else. You just have to speak like yourself. And that's what this episode is about. How I stopped hiding. How I stopped judging. And how I started believing. Even if my English is still growing, my voice deserves to be part of this world. There was a day, not dramatic, not loud, but it stayed with me. I was speaking with someone I had just met. My English was slow that day. I couldn't find the words I wanted. My sentences felt messy. I even repeated myself a few times. But I kept going because the topic mattered, because I cared about what we were talking about, and because the person I was speaking with, they were patient. When I finally finished, I said what I always said in those moments. Sorry, my English is not very good, but they looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Are you kidding? I understood everything you said, and honestly, it made me feel something. I paused. Surprised? Confused? Really? I asked. Yeah, they said. You didn't speak fast, but you spoke real, and that's why I listened. And that moment broke something in me. It broke the belief that said, if your English isn't perfect, people won't care. Because now I knew something deeper. When you speak with heart, you don't need perfect grammar. You need courage. And when your voice comes from a real place, people don't just hear your words, they feel them. After that conversation, I started paying more attention to the phrases I used every day. I realized something. The sentences that made people feel connected to me were never the longest. They were the most real. It wasn't. I apologize for my limited ability to express myself. It was, I don't know all the words, but I care. It wasn't. I'm sorry for my poor pronunciation. It was, please tell me if I say something confusing. And it wasn't. I'm just learning, so I'll stay quiet. It was, I want to try, even if I make mistakes. I discovered something I hadn't seen before. Fluency isn't about vocabulary size, it's about emotional presence. When I said, thank you for listening. I'm nervous, but I'm trying. This means a lot to me. People heard my humanity, and once I saw how that made people feel safe, how it opened doors instead of closing them, I stopped trying to sound impressive. I started trying to sound honest. And that's when my voice became powerful, not because I knew more words, but because I meant everyone I said. Once I stopped hiding behind silence, once I stopped apologizing for how I sounded, I started using my English voice in more places. At first, it was small moments, a quick chat with someone in line, asking a question in a bookstore, saying hello to a new neighbor, and every time something beautiful happened. People responded, they leaned in, they smiled, they listened. Even when my grammar wasn't perfect, even when I spoke slowly, because now I wasn't trying to impress. I was trying to connect, and people felt that. I remember one man I met in a cafe. He was reading a book I liked. Normally, I would have just looked, said nothing, and walked past. But that day I said, that's a great book. I read part of it. Really powerful. He looked up, smiled, and we started talking. 10 minutes later, we were laughing like old friends. He didn't care about my accent. He didn't test my grammar. He just heard a real person trying to share something real. And that was enough. That's the moment I realized something big. The world doesn't need perfect English. It needs your real voice. It needs people who care, people who try, people who speak even when they're scared, because they want to belong. And when you show up like that, you open doors you never knew existed, doors to friendships, to kindness, to life itself. If you've ever stayed quiet because you didn't like how your English sounded, I understand. If you've ever walked away from a conversation because your words felt stuck or not good enough, I've been there. But I want you to hear this clearly today. Your English voice matters, even if it's soft, even if it's slow, even if it's still learning. You don't need a perfect accent to speak with feeling. You don't need long sentences to be meaningful. You don't need to be fluent to be understood. Every time you say something in English, you're building a bridge, and someone is waiting on the other side of that bridge, ready to meet you, not for your grammar, but for your story, because your voice carries more than words. It carries you, your effort, your culture, your kindness, your truth, and that deserves to be heard. There was a time when I could hear every English word, but I didn't understand anything. People would talk, and I could hear the sounds. I knew they were speaking English, but my brain didn't catch it. It felt like water running too fast through my hands. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold on to anything. I knew grammar. I knew vocabulary. I had studied for years, but in real conversations, I was lost, because no one talks like a textbook. No one speaks in slow, perfect sentences. They speak in rhythm, in feeling, in music, and I didn't know how to listen to that yet. That's when I realized something important. If I wanted to speak like a real person, I had to start listening like one too. Not just listening to words, but listening for flow, for tone, for pauses, for emotion. That's what native speakers do. That's how they understand each other, even when the grammar isn't perfect, and that's what I needed to learn. Once I realized that understanding English was more about rhythm than grammar, I started listening differently. I stopped trying to catch every single word. I stopped pausing the video every 2 seconds. I stopped translating in my head. Instead, I listened for the feeling. Here's what I did. When I watched something, a YouTube video, a podcast, even a movie scene, I didn't focus on the words first. I focused on the voice, the rhythm, the energy, the music of the sentence I listened for. When the speaker slowed down, when they paused, when their voice rose at the end of a question, when they sounded confident, when they softened to show care, and slowly, I began to understand not just what they were saying, but how they were saying it, and that changed everything, because when I listened like that, I started speaking like that too. Not robotic, not stiff, but natural. Because I had heard the music of English, and now it was inside me. I was learning the real language, the emotional language, the human language, and I didn't need perfect grammar to follow it. I just needed to listen with attention and heart. As I listened more closely, not just to words, but to tone, to pauses, to feeling, something surprising started to happen. I began to connect with people in a much deeper way, even when I didn't speak much, even when I didn't say the perfect sentence, because now I was listening with emotion, not just information. Someone would say, "I had a rough day," and I wouldn't just translate it in my head. I could feel it in their voice. I'd say, "I'm sorry to hear that. Want to talk about it?" And they'd relax, because I wasn't just using the right grammar. I was responding with care. Another person might say, "It's been one of those weeks," and I'd smile and say, "Yeah, I get that." Simple words, but full of connection. That's when I realized listening with your heart makes your English feel more alive. Because when you listen like a native, you don't only hear structure, you hear people, and that's what changes your English. That's what changes your conversations. That's what changes you. The more I listened like that, deeply, slowly, with presence, the more my speaking changed. Not because I memorized better words, but because I started responding like a human being, not a language student. Here's what I mean. Before, when someone asked me a question, my brain would go into panic. Which tense should I use? Is this grammar okay? Wait, what was the rule? And by the time I finished thinking, the moment was gone. But after I trained myself to listen emotionally, I didn't need to overthink. I could just feel what the conversation needed. If someone asked, "How was your weekend?" I wouldn't panic. I'd pause and say, "It was quiet. I stayed home and rested." Simple, true, and connected. That's the power of deep listening. You stop trying to perform, and you start responding. You speak from presence, not from pressure. And when your speaking comes from presence, you sound more fluent, even if your sentences are short, because fluency isn't just speed. It's flow, it's honesty, it's listening first, and speaking from what you feel. If you've listened to all these stories, from the first time I spoke in a cafe, to the moments I failed in public, from mirror practice, to quiet days, in bookstores and parks, to the first real conversations I ever had, then you already know something important. Confidence isn't something that arrives all at once. It's something you build, one sentence at a time. You've heard how I once apologized before every sentence, how I felt invisible in conversations, how I didn't believe I deserved to speak yet. But you've also heard how I changed that, not through perfect grammar, not through studying more, but by speaking with courage and with heart. Because I discovered something that changed my entire English journey. Fluency doesn't start in your mouth. It starts in your mindset. And confidence isn't about being loud. It's about being present, even in your quietest voice. I told you how small talk saved me from silence, how soft phrases helped me feel like myself, how kindness from others and from myself helped me grow from shy to steady, and I told you how I began to listen differently, not to catch every word, but to feel the language, to connect, to respond from the heart, and that made me not just a better speaker, but a more human one. So now I want to speak directly to you, whether you're just starting or you've been learning English for years, whether you speak with confidence or still whisper your sentences inside your head, whether you love your voice or you're still afraid to be heard. Please remember this. You don't need perfect English to be powerful. You just need your voice, exactly as it is. You are already becoming fluent every time you try, every time you speak, every time you choose connection over fear. You don't need more grammar to be seen. You need more trust in yourself. You don't need longer sentences to matter. You just need to show up with heart. And that's what you've done by listening to this series. You've shown up. You've said yes to your voice. And that means more than you know. This podcast wasn't just a list of tips. It was a reminder that your journey matters, that your voice matters, and that fluency is not about being perfect. It's about being real. So take what you've learned here, the stories, the rhythms, the emotions, and speak. Speak to yourself. Speak to strangers. Speak to your future. Even when you're tired. Even when you're shy. Even when it's slow or messy or unsure, speak anyway. Because that's how your English grows. And that's how your confidence will find its voice. For good. If these stories helped you, share them with someone else who's still afraid to speak. Let them hear what fluency sounds like. When it's full of heart, not fear. Until next time, keep learning, keep listening, keep speaking, and most of all, keep trusting that your English is already a voice worth hearing. You don't need permission. You are the permission. And your story deserves to be spoken out loud. You're not just learning English anymore, you're living in it, and I'm proud of you.